Welcome to this module in which we'll provide an overview of data collection with specific emphasis on interviews. So at the conclusion of this module, you should be able to identify the differences between interviews and specific interview techniques, including the in-depth interview and focus group discussions. So in conducting any type of research, so whether it be evaluation or otherwise, we want to have clear objectives for our project. We want to create them what we call a priori, so that is prior to conducting the project rather than post hoc once we actually know what the results are. So for each project, we want to have a study objective. So here we've got one to identify whether regular use of multivitamins increases well-being. So looking at it on face value, it seems to be a decent objective until we start probing a little bit more. We can look at the outcome itself, well-being. So what is well-being? How do we define it? Is it mortality, survival, quality of life? How are we going to measure well-being? Is it a mental, spiritual, physical perspective? All of these questions relate to the objective. So although it's easy to, I guess, come up with a study objective, trying to delve deeper into it and trying to identify, okay, well, how are we going to measure it? By what means are we going to measure it? Who's going to measure it? So is it quantitative? Is it a qualitative perspective? Is it a combination of both? Will inform how detailed our study objective needs to be. So in any type of research or evaluation, we need to have not only a primary objective or outcome, but also secondary objectives as well. We're not just interested typically in one thing. We may be interested in one main thing, but there are also a number of other issues that we would be interested in. So these would be our secondary objectives. So primary objectives answer the critical question, whereas secondary questions answer the subsidiary questions. So if we're looking at it from I guess, clinical point of view, we may be looking at whether or not Panadol is more effective than Nurofen. So is paracetamol more effective than ibuprofen at pain relief in those people that suffer from headaches? So that may be our primary outcome. Secondary outcomes may be toxicity, adverse events, quality of life, etc., etc. So in terms of, I guess, measurement in clinical research and in public health research, there's a variety of ways in which we can go about collecting our data. And they relate to, obviously, our quantitative and qualitative perspectives. From a quantitative point of view, we can collect data. So that data can be either numerical or it can be categorical. So that can be further broken down across the two groups. So numerical data could be either continuous or discrete, whereas categorical data can be what we call nominal or ordinal. So in this slide, we're going to run through a couple of examples of our different types of data. So numerical data can be, as the name suggests, things to do with numbers. So it could be blood pressure, it could be the number of siblings that I may have or an individual may have. Whereas categorical, we're looking at different types of numerical data. So whether it be blood type or whether it be pain. Now, each of these, I guess, are different in terms of the types of data that we've got. So our numerical data here, blood pressure is what we would call continuous. So blood pressure, height, weight, all occurs on a continuous scale. Whereas siblings is an example of discrete or whole numbers. So I can have 1, 2, 3, 4 brothers and sisters. I can't have 1.5 or 2.5. So that's the difference between, I guess, continuous numerical data and discrete numerical data. With our categorical, we've got two different types. So we've got our nominal and we've got our ordinal. So nominal being, again, the data falls into a category, but there's no real order to it. So you can be blood type A, AB, B, O. There's no real order to it, as opposed to something like pain, which could be measured on a scale. So a 5-point Likert scale, 1 is low pain, 5 is high pain. So this is what we would refer to as ordinal data. 5 is higher than 4, which is higher than 3, which is higher than 2, etc., etc. Whereas this type of categorical data, blood type, is nominal. There's no real order to it. Now, data in clinical research and public health research can be reported from a variety of perspectives, whether it be clinically reported, patient-reported, or self-reported data. So clinical data uses independent instruments to measure the outcome. So something like blood pressure, assays, etc., where we're using these instruments which have been independently calibrated in order to measure the outcome of interest. So whether it be blood pressure, whether it be looking at red blood cell count, whatever it may be. They've been independently calibrated. So the level of variation, or I guess the level or how trustworthy it is, or the amount of bias in the outcome that we're measuring is fairly minimal. Then we go in terms of measuring the data and how the setting may influence the measurement itself. So if we think about this example is something like music therapy. So music therapy has been shown, depending on the setting, to be fairly effective at decreasing patient participant anxiety, increasing quality of life, etc. Now, one thing to consider is whether or not the setting makes an impact. So if you were to think of music therapy in a hospital setting, how effective would that be when you compare it to conducting the same type of music therapy, but the setting is a patient or participant's home, where they feel more comfortable, where they have a friendlier environment, more comfortable environment. So it's those types of negligible or confounding factors that may have an impact in terms of the environment in which we collect our data. The next type of data that we're looking at is patient and self-reported data. So patient data, looking at the completion of questionnaires or the like when it comes to reporting on behaviours, attitudes, psychological outcomes. So something like the SF-36 questionnaire is a typical example of patient-collected data, data that the patient completes and then we analyse. Slightly different to patient self-reported data. So if we're thinking of a public health intervention where we're trialling an exercise regime and we're asking the patients to also complete a diary of their diet and exercise, that would be an example of patient self-reported data. It's a great form of data collection because it's participatory in terms of involving the patients or participants in the research, but it also brings a level or a certain degree of potential for bias. You can sort of almost imagine now if you're a patient and you wanted to please the investigators, you may inadvertently or intentionally, depending on your motivations, falsify the information that you're reporting in your diary. You might be saying that you didn't have those that dinner from McDonald's or KFC, that you did have your meat and veggies every night, that you did exercise 3 times a week, when in reality it may have been different. So those types of examples are what we call response bias. So participants actively falsifying information in order to either please the investigators or thinking that, well, I should have been doing this, but I didn't, so I want to make it at least look like I'm trying. The other type of bias that can be associated with patient self-reported data is genuine bias that we call recall bias. So if I complete my exercise and I'm trying to eat as healthy as possible, but I'm not completing my diary, and then I realize, oh geez, I haven't completed it, let me go back, try and actually remember what you did last week or the week before can be difficult. If we're asking people, just generally speaking, how many times last week did you exercise? How many times did you drink more than 8 glasses of water? How many times did you, go to bed before 10 p.m.? Genuinely speaking, I couldn't tell you, and that would be a genuine bias, that form of recall bias. So moving on to different types of interviews, there are 3 types of, interviews that we can use. What we call a scheduled standardized interview, where the questions and the number of questions and the order of those questions is structured before we even commence. So all those aspects, regardless, I should say, of the number of times that we conduct the interview and with the variety of participants that we're going to conduct it, the questions must be asked in the same order, at the same speed, in the same structure, in order to maintain that uniform structure of interviewing. The second type of interview is what we call a non-scheduled standard interview. So this allows a little bit more flexibility in the sense that you've got your 10 questions that you want to ask, but you have flexibility in terms of how you ask them. It doesn't need to be in the same order, but you need to cover the questions during the interview. The final is the non-standardized interview, in which case you've got your questions, but really you're letting the participant lead the discussion. And what you're hoping to achieve is that the interview is more of a reflective piece from the participant, in which during the interview process, you're actually, facilitating discussion, and hopefully you will hit upon those points of interest. Now, that type of non-standard interview can also be conducted in a group setting, which we call a focus group discussion. So the 2 types of interviews that we can do is a one-on-one interview or in-depth interview with one participant, or we can take 6 to 8 to 10 people at a time, and as a group have that group discussion. So in terms of, the 2 types of interviews or focus group discussions very much lend themselves to the non-standardized interview, where you'll get a lot of people putting in their opinions, and throughout conducting the discussion for an hour or so, you will have reached most of the questions that were of interest from your perspective. You won't get necessarily the depth of information, but you will get information from a variety of participants. On the flip side, conducting interviews individually with participants provides a lot more richness to the data. So in a 30-minute interview, you would get much more detailed information as opposed to a 60-minute focus group. However, you've only got data from one person, so there's always that issue of balancing up how rich your data is compared to how much time you've got to collect it. How you conduct your interview, so whether it be an in-depth interview or a focus group interview, may also be restricted in terms of the surroundings, the setting that you find yourself in. So depending on your setting, you may look at a variety of ways of conducting your interviews. So whether it be face-to-face, telephone, you can even do email, I guess through Messenger, or even a video link or video conference style of interview. Each of them have their obvious strengths and limitations. Through each, you will either have the presence or the absence of these factors. So things like verbal cues, non-verbal cues, so the way in which a person reacts to a question, positions themselves, so moving forward, moving back, crossing their arms, turning right, turning left, the relative ease, so whether they're in a relaxed pose as opposed to cross-armed approach. Body language plays a huge role in interviews as well. So regardless of whether you're doing an in-depth interview, a one-on-one interview, or a group interview, having a recording of these non-verbal cues can be just as a rich source of data as the interview themselves. The interview will provide you obviously with the words, but the body language can provide you with a sense of context as well. So a person may be saying one thing, but when you look at their body language, it tells you a completely different story.